globally, IOM is a leader in what you call the CCCM cluster, the Camp Coordination and Camp Management cluster within the Global Disaster Management structure. And that has to do very much with emergency shelter, what we call locally emergency shelter, as a tool of disaster preparedness and disaster response. And so in terms of the Kalinago territory, our involvement and interventions in the Kalinago territory have been in repairing, rehabilitating emergency shelters. It has all been around the emergency shelter function. So repair and rehabilitation of emergency shelters in the territory, provision of backup power and water for those emergency shelters, training of shelter managers, and raising the awareness of the Kalinago community in terms of preparedness and response to emergencies.
Okay, so that would be the focus for IOM.
That has been the focus. That has been our focus in the community. So as far as let's say resilience of the community, one of the things that is recognized, and Hurricane Maria brought it very much to the fore, is that the resilience of housing, the quality of housing in the territory was not necessarily up to par
prior to Maria.
And so I would say that since Maria there has been some improvement in that, because different agencies, well, first of all, the government of Dominica, as the state is responsible for responses, right? And so the government of Dominica has facilitated interventions in terms of housing recovery in the Kalinago territory.
Yeah.
And there have been other agencies that have worked in different areas to support the work of the government in building resilience in the territory. But I would say that there is still a lot to be done. As a small island developing state, first of all, Dominica as a whole is very vulnerable to climate events, climatic events, and with climate change almost accelerating, you find that the storms are more frequent and they are more intense.
Yeah.
And so in a community like the Kalinago territory, some of the unique features as indigenous people, their access to finance, for instance, has affected their ability to build resilient housing. Right? So the fact that they do not own land individually, but they own land in common, has affected the ability of individuals to access finance for housing, to build their personal homes, and to build them up to code in a way that can withstand climatic events. And so that has affected the quality of housing across the territory. And that is a common problem, a common challenge for indigenous communities around the world, and something that I think has been recognized. And there have been new modes of financing that have been put in place in different areas in order to try to counteract that and mitigate that. And I think there is an effort here to maybe look at some of those things that we hope will bear fruit in the near future.
Is the IOM aware of or leading efforts to improve energy sufficiency in the territory? Is that important, do you think, for that
resilience
area?
and all of that? Okay, so again, as I explained earlier, within the IOM is UN Migration Agency. Within the UN system, there are different agencies that have particular focus, right? Focus areas, and our focus is really in terms of in relations to climate change. Let's say it has to do with people who have been displaced internally, and also we find externally sometimes due to environmental factors, climate factors, also sometimes conflict and different things, right? In the Dominica case, we have been really focusing on people that have been displaced internally because of environmental events, hurricanes, different types of emergencies, right? And so within that focus, when we've done, for instance, the rehabilitation of emergency shelters in the Kalinago territory, it has been one of the priorities to try to install both backup water and backup electricity, so that in the event of an emergency and you have destruction of, for instance, the main national grid, that you would still have access to electricity for people within the territory. And you tend to find, for instance, with the Sinico Resource Center, that it's a community center as well, right? So if you're able to have electricity within that building, first of all, it will provide for the people who are sheltering there temporarily, as in the emergency shelter setting, but it's also a community center, so you can also assist with basic things like charging phones and those kinds of things, because we also acknowledge that communication is practically a human right. It is one of the things that is very important for people's, even their psychosocial health, and for their ability to put things in place for them to be able to recover quickly. So yes, access to renewable energy. What was the question?
Renewable energy.
Yes, okay. So access to renewable energy, both from the standpoint of affordability. So we found, for instance, that when we installed the solar system on the Sinico Resource Center, the decision was taken by the community that they would use it not only in an emergency shelter setting, but that they would prefer to use this renewable energy on an ongoing basis, because it's more affordable, as opposed to just leaving it as backup power. So yes, it is important. It's important that people have access to energy, and it's important that people have access to backup power in the event of a disaster. And it's also important that we try to use more and more renewable energy, because we know that the goal in terms of restricting and reducing the negative impacts of climate change, there is a global goal to reduce the increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees by 2100. And we are already seeing that there has been an increase of 1.2 degrees, and we're not even yet at 2030. We're not even yet at 2030, we're still in 2022, right? So any contribution I think that we can make to reducing the amount of fossil fuels used is a positive one, but we are not really involved in, let's say, individual homes and their access to renewable energy.
Okay, thank you for that. Have you noticed, in terms of the focus of the IOM, have you noticed any issue with migration, internal migration, with the Kalinago people in recent years?
Well, we did see, for instance, that there were some families who were still resident in shelters, in emergency shelters, up to maybe 2 years after Hurricane Maria, which is really not the ideal situation. Ideally, emergency shelters are temporary housing, and what you strive for is to achieve durable solutions, to enable people to find durable solutions for themselves, really. And so that was a challenge. But these families have been assisted eventually to recover their housing. But as I said, because of the lack of access to finance in the traditional financial system, this may kind of be an ongoing challenge, because if there is another disaster and people have major issues with their housing, their houses are damaged, their houses need major repairs, if they're not able to access financing, then it means that they fall back on the emergency shelter function to have safe shelter, which is again a basic human right. And so that is one of the challenges that we see. As I said, we really hope that the moves that are being made to be able to put some kind of system in place for the Kalinago people to be able to access funding for their financing for their personal ambitions, including safe housing, that those moves will bear fruit in the near future.
Thank you for that. Do you believe the Kalinago people are fully aware of the reality of the negative effects of climate change?
I believe that the Kalinago people in their traditions are even more closely connected to nature than probably the rest of the population in Dominica. Their culture and their traditions have kept them very close, I think, to nature and to the natural assets. And so yes, I think that they have recognized and that they see the very present changes in terms of the negative impacts of climate change. Whether they are as aware academically of it, I cannot really venture to say, but I think that they have recognized the changes that have been taking place in their natural environment and how it affects their own lives.
From a global standpoint, I'm sure you've heard the term climate justice before. I mean, our Prime Minister in some cases have, without saying the term, hinted to that at major meetings, especially post-Hurricane Maria, saying that though we are not the contributors to climate change, the negative effects of climate change, we get the brunt of it every year. I mean, islands like Dominica, small developing states like Dominica did not bring this on themselves, but they have to deal with it. I mean, who is to blame for that? Do you believe a mechanism at some point at a world level needs to be put in place to help small island developing states build a level of resilience against these monstrous climatic events?
Within the UN system, it is something that has been recognized that the largest economies, the industrialized nations, have contributed the most to climate change, but that very often small island developing states like ours, like those in the Pacific, often, as you say, bear the brunt of climate change and the effects of climate change. And so the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been calling repeatedly for an increased investment by the larger economies in particular in financing for adaptation, for climate change adaptation. This is something that the UN has been calling for repeatedly. Just recently in an the Austria Climate Summit, I think it was, just this year, the UN Secretary General again made that call, noting that given the current state of the climate, and actually the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, which has caused many of the industrialized countries to backtrack on their initial commitments to reduce the use of fossil fuels. You find now that they are doubling down on the use of fossil fuels. And so as we are at present in terms of the goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we're now at 1.2 degrees. And so it has been recognized that there is a need by 2030 to probably reduce emissions by 45%, which is huge, at a time when countries are increasing their use of fossil fuel based on the effects of the war in Europe right now. So it certainly is a challenge, and I mean the islands the islands do not contribute significantly to emissions, so we are not able to make huge changes as far as emissions go. Obviously we contribute, and we can try to reduce our contribution, which will also affect our own level of pollution, for instance, right? Pollution of our own atmosphere.
Right.
However, the major choice that we have is adaptation. How do we adapt to these stronger storms, these more frequent storms? How do we adapt to rising sea levels? How do we adapt to prolonged drought and to flooding? Because you have both sides. And so these are the areas where really we can respond. And given that, I mean, for instance, the effects of Hurricane Maria were more than double of our gross national product, or gross domestic product, right? And so it's obvious that our internal funding, our ability to adapt based on our national resources as small island developing states is not sufficient. And so it means that we require the support of the global community. And in particular, we require that the larger economies, who are the biggest contributors to global warming, recognize that they also have a duty to assist with adaptation and financing for adaptation. So there is a call for more climate adaptation financing, different mechanisms that are not necessarily all loans, that you have a mix of loan and grant, and that you have different ways of let's say innovative means of national insurance and that kind of thing that will assist with adaptation. I mean, we also have our personal changes to make. So for instance, here in Dominica we have our waterways, and we are able to manage how we keep our waterways clean so that we are not affected heavily unnecessarily by flooding, right? So that if we don't keep our waterways clear, including drainage and that kind of thing within built communities, then that will increase the risk of flooding. So we also have these small actions to take that we can take individually and we can take as communities. But nationally, there is definitely a need, as far as small island developing states are concerned, for climate adaptation financing in order to achieve some kind of climate justice.
Maxine, I want to thank you for taking the time out to do this important interview. I do hope that we in the future can work together again. Thanks again.
Sure, no problem, Richie.